We're going to start with our knitted cast on. We need a tail of about a good 6 inches because we need that to be able to work that into the cloth afterward. So I'm just going to make a slip knot. I can just wrap the yarn around my finger. I have a bit of a loop, and now we're going to pick up the other strand through that loop, and we have made a slip stitch or a slip knot. The needle goes into that loop. I'm just going to pull that down tight against the needle. And in knitting, you're always working from the left needle onto the right. But for the time being, we are going to be putting our stitches onto the left needle. So with my right needle, I'm inserting it into the loop that we made, and you can see that it's behind the left needle. I'm going to make sure that I take my working yarn, not the little tail that we had. I'm going to take that yarn, wrap it around the right needle, and I want to make sure that it's sitting against that little bar that we have there. And with the right needle, I'm going to scoop a loop through there and take that loop that we just made and put it onto the left needle. It looks kind of loose and mess right now. I'm just going to pull on that tail yarn to pull that up, and it's got a little bit snug. Again, we've already made one stitch, but that first loop is going to count as a stitch. Again, my right needle goes up into that last stitch that we made. Your right needle is sitting behind the left needle. Take my working yarn, wrap it around, loop it around the right needle, and pull it so it's sitting against that bar. And with my right needle, I'm going to scoop that stitch through there, and you can make it as big as long as you want, and you're going to take it and put it back onto the left needle. And with my working yarn, I can just pull that down again. I'm taking the yarn and putting it around the right needle against that first bar, and with the point of the needle I'm scooping it out and putting it on. There are two parts of the needle that you have to be aware of. You've got the pointy part that is, in a sense, your working section, and the barrel. When you're making your stitches, you want to make sure that when you've finalized your stitch, that you're going to put it onto the barrel of the needle. Don't leave it on the tip, because you're going to make it too tight, and you're going to have very, very tight work, and it's going to be very difficult to work. So we're going to just keep on doing that. Again, the working yarn around the right needle, and dig it in to pull up that loop, and put the loop back onto the left needle. This is the knitted cast on. And we're going to do that for 40 stitches. And in knitting, you only have basically 2 stitches. One of them is the knit stitch, and the other is the purl stitch. And in knitting, the combined series of stitches will make up a pattern, which is also referred to as a stitch. And what we are working toward right now is what is called the garter stitch. And this is what we will be making, because this is all knit stitch. And this is a very simple, this is called the garter stitch, and we're only using the knit stitch to make this cloth. Now that I have 20 stitches on my needle just for demonstration. Once you have all of your stitches put on, we're now going to knit the stitches. So again, the same way that you did before, the right needle with the point is going into that first loop, and your needle is still positioned behind the left needle. And again, the way you did before, you're going to take your working yarn, wrap it around the right needle, and again you want it to be against that little bar stitch that you made before. And we're still going to be scooping that loop, but instead of putting it back onto the needle the way we did to make a stitch, we are now going to slide it off. So again, your right needle goes into the loop, wrap your yarn around the right needle, scoop that loop out, and slide it off the left needle onto the right. Again, your right needle up through that loop, through that stitch on the left needle, and your needle is positioned behind the left needle. Wrap the yarn around the right needle and scoop it up and slide it off. And you can see that now I'm actually positioning my stitch onto the point of the needle rather than working from the barrel. And the stitch is firstly going onto the point of my right needle, but then I want to make sure that I get the stitch formed onto the barrel of the needle, because that's where your size of your stitch is going to be established, compared to leaving it on the point. If I leave it on the point, it's going to be extremely tight. So this is where you want your stitch to be formed, on the barrel of the needle. Again, and this is knitting. So you're going to slide it from the left needle onto the right. And when you're getting to the end, you can also see that the way I'm positioning this, I'm holding I have my needle is being left needle is being supported by my last two fingers, and I'm essentially holding the work in my first two fingers, and my needle on the right is being supported by my entire hand. So therefore, when I go to drop the needle to be able to handle the yarn, my thumb and first two fingers are still holding on to the work and both needles at that point. So when we come to the end of that of the row of stitches, and I'll just keep moving my stitches down the needle to make sure that they don't fall off, and there's my last stitch that I've taken off, and we've got our first row of stitches completed. Now I'm going to transfer that needle with all the stitches onto my left hand, because again it's become the left needle. And as I said earlier before, you're always working from the left needle onto the right. So I'm just going to start again with this row, make sure I've got my working yarn, not the tail yarn, and just do the same that we did before to make our second row of knitting. And to create some tension of the working yarn, I actually have it sort of wrapped around my ring finger, under the middle finger, and over the index finger, which gives me a bit of tension. So from the bottom it looks like this, and that's why I've got a bit of tension, and I still have control of the yarn. Instead of dropping it completely, I have it still controlled in my hand, as opposed to just dropping it completely and having to find it to pick it up and make the stitch, and have to find the yarn and pick it up. This way I have it in my hand, so there's less work to have to find the yarn to make those stitches. A couple of things to watch out for. You have to be careful not to split your yarn, and that means instead of going, sometimes you can split the yarn by not getting your whole strand here, but also by getting it only through part of the yarn. And you can see that I have one strand from the yarn here, and so most of it is there. Avoid that, because that, first of all, you're not going to have a very tidy result, but also this is actually weakening your strand, so you want to make sure to avoid splitting your yarn. So another difficulty that a lot of people have is that they don't remember. You have to remember that you're going to slip this one stitch off of the needle. You're making the stitch and sliding the other stitch, the old stitch, off of the needle. And sometimes people forget to slide, to actually make that first stitch completely, and then they slide the old stitch off, and you can see here, in a sense, I have two stitches instead of just the one stitch, which should have looked like that. So again, I can show you how that mistake is made. So instead of picking this up and sliding the whole thing off, I have picked up my stitch and slid off the old stitch and the new stitch onto the right needle, which ends up making two stitches instead of one. Once you have finished your work, I've made this one square. When you have your work on your needles, if you want to, you can either count your rows, 40 rows, or you can just simply take the corner and measure it up to theirs if you want to make sure that you have it square. If you don't want to do the whole square thing, you just want to do half, that's okay. When you finish your work, I'm now going to show you how to bind off the stitches. In your patterns, you're going to find a reference to cast off or bind off. Cast off is usually used when you are creating some shaping around armholes of a sweater around the neck, and binding off usually refers to removing all of the stitches off the needles. And there will be a reference to either bind off knitwise or bind off purlwise. We've only been knitting, so we're going to bind off knitwise. That means that we're going to knit two stitches together, and you'll see I have moved my stitches up to the point of the needle, so it's easier to get my needle into two stitches instead of just one. And we're going to knit these two stitches, and I've got my loop, and instead of leaving that on my right needle the way we were as if we were knitting, I'm going to put it back onto the left needle. And again, I'm going to now knit the next two stitches together. I'm making my little loop, and again, that is going back onto the left needle. And we're going to continue doing that until we get to the end. And you can see that it's starting to get, I'm starting to have stitches that are worked off completely, and you can see that I've had to pull it right to the very tips of the needles because the stitches can be a bit tight. And you're going to do that for your entire set of 40 stitches that you have on your needles. Okay, we're just coming to the last few stitches. Now, when you're making your stitches, make sure that you give yourself a bit of room, and I'm going to give myself a little bit of a tug, because if I pull my stitch very tightly, eventually you'll end up having your work curled up. So I'm just going to give it a bit of a tug just to make sure that that whole last row is nice and straight. So I just have a couple more stitches to go. And you can see that that's kind of tight, so I'm going to just pull this tight, and you can see that it made a difference how those stitches are going to lay nice and straight for the edge of the work. I did pull that tight, however, when I do the last stitch, I still have lots of room to make sure that it's not getting pulled. Before I cut this off, we're going to make a hanging loop. Remember from the sample, there's that loop. There's two ways to do that. You can either use a crochet hook, if you know how to do a chain with a crochet hook, but you don't need a crochet hook to do a chain stitch. Crocheting is just pulling the strand through and making a loop and doing that. However, we don't need the hook. I'm just going to use my fingers, pull the loop through, and using this bottom thread I'm snugging it up, and I can keep doing that